So we're delighted to be hosting this event today and also to have a great set of speakers. But to kick us off, I'm also delighted that we have our Principal, Sir Jim McDonald, who'll be saying a few words around the conference. But first of all, I have to do my housekeeping. So here's the housekeeping. This event is being recorded, and the link will be shared in-person webinar attendees afterwards. You can put up questions and comments via Mentimeter, so that will really make it a vibrant meeting in which you can get all of your questions out. And I think they're also anonymous as well, so you can ask any question you like there. Those will be moderated and fed into the Q&A session that we'll have at the end. And then there are no scheduled fire drills, so if the alarm does sound, it is real, and we'll go to the fire exits. And then for those people who are here, of course, we'll get lunch at the end in the level 3 foyer, which is just outside. Okay, so with no further ado, I shall pass over to Sir Jim.
Thanks, sir. Well, good morning, colleagues, and very welcome to the Technology and Innovation Centre for the Research Integrity and Culture Week. And you know, my great thanks and appreciation to my colleagues for putting the effort into organising this. There's Tim, Helen, and Emma here, but I know there's been lots of folk from our OSDU unit and the ARCES units. And for those of you who are visiting us, I'll not bother you with the acronyms, but our colleagues from the activities that pull together staff development activities. This is terrific. And a very warm welcome to our colleagues from so many other institutions. It's very warming for me to see that this is a sector-wide challenge, but it's a sector-wide opportunity. A long time coming in terms of the focus that's been coming over recent years, but I think the sense that we're getting through that tipping point where action is following a lot of the, well, and I'll include myself in this comment, the leadership rhetoric that follows action. And the rhetoric's important because it gets the thoughts gathered, but the key thing now is for leadership to get behind colleagues that are in this room today to let you get about the business of delivering and making a difference. This institution's motto is useful learning, and I can think of no better thing to be focusing our collective attentions and talents on other than around the evolution of research integrity and culture. And we're hearing this very important from a pragmatic point of view, as well as the right thing to do. The drivers for this are lining up here, whether it's from UKRI, the CEO, who is well known to all of you, I'm sure, Ottoline Liza, made a commitment right from the outset of her tenure as CEO. I've got the pleasure of sitting on the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology with her, and that was one of the key things that she wanted to address around equality, diversity and inclusivity within the sector and within the research community. And you can see the priorities that are coming through UKRI, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that shortly, that this is action following the words, recognising the contributions that are made by all types of staff to the research endeavour. And that focus on EDI is absolutely critical. Research or development, Concordat, and many more, as well as the national academies. I had the pleasure of catching up with an old friend of mine, Miles Padgett, a moment ago. I'm president of the Royal Academy of Engineering, and we've just released, I think, a very coherent activity that's consistent with what we're talking about today in our awardee excellence network. This is over 1,000 individuals who have been fellows, senior fellows, industrial and academy chairs, chairs in emerging technologies, as a great asset for the academy. But when I look at that group in particular, the EDI characteristics in there are massively more interesting, exciting than and I'll say this, than the typical profile of the fellows group. Now that'll be an evolving and emerging activity, as it is with the Royal Society, the Academy of Medical Sciences, British Academy. I think leadership in its various guises has to have the strength of its convictions, has to have the boldness to release that opportunity where research integrity comes to the fore, the cultures that we are responsible for creating, the environments that we want to drive forward. And let's take a risk of having a go. We might not get it all right first time, but in making efforts, I think we'll start to see the evolution, such as you will be talking about shortly. Again, we talked about my place. I'm not here to just talk about Strathclyde, but there's a set of very simple values in this organisation. And when I tell you them, you're not going to, okay, well, that's pretty obvious. Well, the truth of the matter is that they'll be pretty obvious because we didn't impose them in this place. We discovered them in the place. And there's 5 very simple tenets around which our values are based. That's first and foremost about being people-centric. And that's very important in terms of how we drive research integrity and the culture within which research is undertaken. We're ambitious, and as a community, we should be ambitious that the activities that you're talking about today can be driven forward, because it's innovative, another one of our values. And very importantly, it has to be delivered through strong collaboration. I see some well-kent faces in the audience here with whom I've worked with in the past. And the last one is about being bold. I don't mean bold in the Irish way, we are cheeky to everyone, but I mean bold insofar as that your risk appetite has to grow. And the sector's risk appetite for making a difference in research integrity and culture, I think, will be part of the fuel that drives this forward. And I'm sure I'll get feedback from Tim that this will make a difference, because we want to be bold as well. We want to take a risk as an institution. And I was very happy for Strathclyde to be one of the early signatories to the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, because that aims at ensuring that we are focused on the broader picture of what's needed for high quality research that makes a difference. And that also applies, of course, in the research and innovation space. But this morning's discussion, and I'm sure it's going to be lively. Emma's telling me there's already digitally enhanced questions that will stimulate discussion. But this notion of where next for research integrity and culture, and I do hope that the outcome from today, as well as, again, thanks, Tim, to you and the colleagues for taking a step forward to creating this week's worth of activity. But this morning, getting so many well-respected colleagues in the room for discussion. And I'll simply leave by saying a big thanks to our guest speakers this morning, James Parry from UK Research Integrity Office, Christina Douglas, Research and Ethics Governance in Scottish Universities Project. It's good to have you. Miles, again, it's great to have you back here. And again, Miles, a Royal Society Chair, but very much focused on the research integrity and culture piece, not only in his own activities, but for his university and the sector at large. And last but not least, Lizzie Gadd is Vice Chair for the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment. I, as always, as his Vice-Chancellor, want to come in, give you a stream of consciousness for 10 minutes. Wish you all the very best for the next couple of hours, but I'm genuinely interested in the outcome from today. And Tim and I, and we work very closely together. I do look forward to see what comes out of this, and I make a commitment to those things that you discussed today. I'll make a commitment for as quickly as possible moving this to action within my own organisation. So with that, I shall leave you to your day's work. Nice to see you all, and do enjoy a stimulating session. Thanks a lot.
So we're delighted then to welcome James, first speaker. James, would you come forward? You can introduce yourself. And James Parry from UKRIO.
Thank you very much, everyone. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so my name is James Parry. I'm Chief Executive of a charity called the UK Research Integrity Office. We were created in 2006 as an independent body that gives confidential advice and practical support on anything to do with good research practice. And it's great to be here, not least because Scotland's kind of the reason that UKRIO ever existed. Over 20 years ago now, the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh held a national conference looking at the UK's approach to research integrity. And it concluded that an independent advisory body should be set up to give support to the research community and the public on issues of good research practice. And there was a few years of discussions of how this would be done, who was going to be funded, but that was that recommendation coming out of Scotland was the genesis of UKRIO. So we're here because of your country. So thank you very much for that. And I guess I should also say thank you for my job. Okay, so as I said, we are an independent advisory body, and we advise on and support on this issue of research integrity. And that's basically a fancy way of saying good research practice. And it's about research integrity is about ensuring that research is of high quality and high ethical standards, that it's reliable and ethical. It's also about ensuring that researchers are provided with environments that enable them to do the best research that they can, and that systems and incentives for research practice will promote good practice rather than inadvertently cause people and organizations to cut corners or worse. This isn't something alien or other. This is part of the everyday life of being a researcher. And it's an issue for everyone in research, because without good practice, research is not reliable and it's not trusted, nor is it useful to society, whether policymakers or members of the public. And this wide focus of research integrity on good research practice and on culture and systems and environments has been the case for many years. If you see research integrity discussed, particularly in the mainstream media, but often the academic media too, there can often be a focus on combating research misconduct. This is about research fraud, and you as researchers are all potential criminals and you must be watched. And that isn't what this is about. Addressing fraud is essential, don't get me wrong, but it's part of a wider whole, good research practice. And that's reflected in the issues that are brought to my charity's advisory service. This is a snapshot of one aspect of our advisory service data from 2021. The data from 2022 will be available soon. And this shows that, members of the public, researchers and organizational representatives do contact us about things such as fabrication and falsification of data and plagiarism. But actually the most common issues are things to do with how to get it right. Questions about what research ethics, either the process or ethical issues relating to particular projects. Questions about publication ethics and authorship. How to avoid authorship disputes, what to do if you find yourself embroiled in one, and questions about proactive measures to ensure that individual research projects and research environments are conducive to good research practice. And this is an issue for every discipline of research and every sector. This is kind of the university data, basically, but we get inquiries from all over the shop, including inquiries from outside the UK. UKRIO's a bit different from any national research integrity agencies because we give advice. We're not just kind of collecting data and publishing it. We're not an arm of government or a funder of a National Science Academy. So do people from other countries come to us? Now, the kind of concerns that this focus on good research practice reflects, I think, an evolution of the community's thinking about research integrity. And this is a snapshot of probably 20 years of discussions that range from very dry and dusty to people getting very angry in the pages of academic journals. The top bullet point is probably from about over 20 years ago. Is there a problem with the kind of the reliability of research? And by that, by extension, of researchers? What are the standards for research? Are researchers getting them right or wrong? And if not, why? And that tends to lead to that kind of initial focus on research fraud. Well, obviously bad things in the system. And it's true that the amount of research fraud that we know about is the tip of a much larger iceberg, and surveys and studies show that isn't rare. So between 1% and 2% of researchers can be demonstrated to engage in major research fraud in a short space of time. However, that is nothing compared to the rate of avoidable errors in research, which then leads to the next step in thinking, well, this is actually about good research practice. This is about helping people do the best research that they can. But the thinking to date was all about its individual researchers. How can you and you be supported to do good research? How can we make you and you do the right thing? And actually need to take a step back. This is about culture and systems and leadership, as has just been said by the speakers before me. And then in more recent years, recognition that there are problems within the research community that aren't unique to the research community. Issues of bullying and harassment, issues, the essential need to drive inclusion and diversity, issues that aren't unique to research in any sector and take place in every workspace in every community on the planet. And then most recently, the recognition that cultural change and leadership, while essential, eventually butts up against boundaries. And those boundaries are set by systems and processes. So broad questions which are being explored of whether the systems for research practice, how we fund, how we carry out, how we assess, monitor and disseminate research is conducive to good research practice, or whether it can hinder it. And also questions about researcher careers. Is career sustainability and development right? You're all working in the research profession, you're going to say, no, it isn't. And you're correct in that. Are we teaching researchers what they need to know? Or are we leading them to pick things up as they go along? And it's the latter. Are they picking up good habits or bad? So lots of questions. And this is stuff that's been debated for over 20 years. So there's lots of information, lots of answers out there already. And I'd say, you know, talking about stuff is great, but there need to be some changes as well. Now, this is kind of about the high level stuff about systemic issues in research. There'll be a kind of more practical slide in a bit, but I think there are a number of key high level challenges facing research in the UK, and these challenges are mirrored by situations in other countries as well. This is a global issue, not a UK issue. And I think they relate partly to systems and processes specifically about research integrity, and then there are broader concerns about systems for research. For research integrity, there is a gap in the UK system for dealing with cases of research misconduct. At the moment, it's employers are responsible for addressing any concerns about potential fraud that take place under their auspices. And as a result, both people who raise concerns and people who are accused of committing fraud can feel they're not being treated fairly or openly. Organisations also have a problem that they can conduct what they think are well-founded inquiries, but they're easily open to challenge. Now, a parliamentary committee 5 or 6 years ago proposed effect a kind of regulatory or audit body for this, but that hasn't been taken forward, so there's a gap. And this isn't just a kind of procedural gap. This is not a gap you can describe as a gap in research misconduct. Actually, this is about trust, it's about confidence, because each case of research fraud erodes public trust in research. So something needs to be done to fill that gap. There's also the questions about, if you think of researchers, you are required or encouraged to adopt many common practices and systems within your institution. That's the same in other institutions. Institutions themselves make sure that happens. And then funders and others tell employers in research organizations to kind of harmonize practices as well. And researchers' employers often note that there's a lack of harmonization amongst funders. There's more than there was in recent years, but the system is currently, researchers are overseen and supported by employers to make sure researchers meet standards of good practice. Funders make sure employers meet their responsibilities. However, who's making sure the funders do their thing? And there are lots, you know, if anyone works in giving reports to funders, lots of conflicting requirements of data, and also I can see some people smiling and or groaning and wincing in the audience. So there's a lack of harmonization there. More is being done in recent years than there have been. Don't get me wrong. Funders are taking stuff about research integrity and broader problems in research very, very seriously. And I echo previous speakers' remarks about Otterley and Laser and UKRIO and others in this in the funding space, the Wellcome Trust and many others. But again, there's a gap there. In terms of the research community itself, the stuff that affects everybody, the phrase publish or perish will be depressingly familiar to most of you. There is a churn in the system. Quantity is favored over quality. There is a constant drive to publish the right results in the right journals and do so very quickly. And heaven help you if you're not getting lovely amounts of grant funding coming in all the time. This leads to burnout, it leads to poor practice. Something needs to be done. There's also the time pressures. Something you see again and again in development activities for researchers is take time to do your research, engage in self-reflective practice. And this is really, really important, but you're never given the time to do it. Do your research, fulfill all those lovely goals about data and publications and grants. Also sit on 17 million committees. If you're a student, get your degree. If you're not a student, help other people get their degrees. And by the way, do your research at a slower pace and be more reflective. How do you deal with those time pressures? And then you've got the fact that the organizational cultures are shaped by national and international systems for research. So there's a huge web of stuff there to untangle. It doesn't mean it's hopeless. There is lots of good initiatives being done and more can be done, but the pressures are there and they're very, very real, and they cause people's research careers to burn out and fade very, very quickly. It is not easy being a researcher. Now, that's one reason why UKRIO was set up. We exist to advise and support. We help organizations and individuals with how to get it right, what to do if things go wrong, and what to do if you suspect research fraud. We've been around since 2006. We're a registered charity supported by funds from, it's about 115, 16 organisations at the moment, including Strathclyde. Thank you very much. And we're the UK's most experienced research integrity agency. We've got a lot of practical advice under our belt. As a confidential advisory body. That's where our roots are. We've been doing a lot of quiet work in the background, and we're going to be a bit more loud in the future, and there'll be some things coming up soon. In the meantime, when the slides get circulated, we do free webinars. Next one's on the 22nd of February with a huge bank of slides and recordings you can have a look at. We've got an online, if you go to our Twitter, UKRIO, we've got a New Year Research Integrity Challenge, we've got blog posts, lots of publications, have a look, and there are ways of contacting us if you need advice and support. We're UKRIO.org. Finally, as I said, we've been running an advisory service since 2006. I feel quite old because I was there when we started in 2006. But here are some kind of key lessons we've learned. The first is be positive, be helpful, facilitate good research practice. The second is relevancy is really important. We need to recognize there's no one single way, one single right way of doing research. Different disciplines work in very different ways. My background's in archaeology. If I talk to a medical researcher, say, or a creative artist, there'll be underlying themes that are in common in how we approach research, but the everyday practicalities some will be similar, some will be very different, and some will seem completely weird, but they make perfect sense for that other academic tradition. It's really important. Relevancy. Think about the different needs of disciplines, but also think about what are the issues that you as a researcher need help with, what your colleagues need help with. Feed that back to your organization, for your organization, work out what your people need and help them with that. And also, I think we need to think about how we do research, and that can be challenging, not just because of the time pressures I mentioned earlier, also because the standards of research seem fairly self-evident. Please don't make stuff up. Stealing the work of others is bad. Harming your research participants is generally frowned upon, and please don't embezzle your research funds. Those are the 4 basic standards for research. They seem very simple, but actually in practice, they're very challenging to meet. There's no universal definition of what is or isn't plagiarism, for example. No universal definition of who should or shouldn't be an author. And don't get me started on the order of authorship. And all this stuff matters because as researchers, you're assessed on how many publications you author. And if you're in multi-author fields, where your position in the authorship is. This is really relevant stuff. I think the way out is culture and leadership. A compliance mechanism only takes you so far. Training development takes you a bit further. But this is about culture and leadership and providing the right environment, one where researchers feel empowered, one where there is no stigma attached to people saying they need help, and where sources of support are easily accessible. And in terms of systems and incentives, which are beyond the control of individual researchers or even individual organizations, there must be cohesive work by the entire sector and by policymakers to make sure they help good research practice rather than impede it. And finally, harking back to that slide, which summarized discussions of over 20 years, there's been a wealth of discussions on these issues. There's so much data out there. And I think it's great to talk about this stuff, but it's actually time to do more about it. There's lots of good practice, lots of interesting initiatives going on, and we're going to hear about them from 3 of those from great speakers coming up. But I think it's time for action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, James. Really, really interesting, challenging slides. So look forward to the discussion. And don't forget, you can already put questions into the Mentimeter already. So we'll build those up for the Q&A later on. So pleased to welcome now Christina Douglas.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me. So I'm Christina Douglas. I'm actually coming from the University of Aberdeen, but today I'm representing a project that I've been working on at the University of Edinburgh on ethics governance in Scottish universities. So just to give a little bit maybe of a background, how I came to this project, I'm a medical anthropologist, and you might think, what do I have to do with ethics regulation, with ethics governance? So my project at the University of Aberdeen looks into people living with dementia and the relationship they develop with therapy animals. So you might think, of course, that I had a lot to do with ethics. So I come from what we can call maybe, and probably lots of people know, a position of struggle with ethics and with research governance as well. How do we manage these kind of things? So when I've joined this project, I just wanted to see how things are working. How are actually things in these research ethics committees? Because for researchers, I think most of the time, is something that is a bit esoteric, if we can call it like that. What is going on over there? How is decision taken? Are things really going well? How do we get our feedback back? So all these kind of things. So as I was saying, this project has been led actually at the University of Edinburgh, and the PI was Dr. Edada. He's coming from the School of Law, and he's a reader in health law and regulation. He has been looking actually quite a lot at NHS research ethics committees as well. So he was coming from that point, from that perspective as well. So just very broadly speaking, the things that we were looking at and we wanted to find out is what actually goes well. How those ones who are members of these committees, including academic members, lay and external members, administrators and managers, how do they see these kind of things? What goes well? What doesn't go so well? Because not everything is, of course, just happy. And how things can be actually done better. What are those areas of improvements that people identify? So for this one, because it was a qualitative study, we've looked at document analysis. So what are those kind of regulation that is coming from higher up? So for instance, excellence frameworks, research and integrity frameworks, all sorts of ethics, codes of ethics from professional associations. So there is a massive amount of these kind of things, plus of course, all the standard operating procedures for research ethics committees, sometimes published on their website, on university's website, other times maybe circulating internally. So we've been looking at that first of all, just to see what is coming from the top. Then we've conducted some interviews with members, with administrators and managers, and with external and lay members as well. These ones were 23. So out of the whole number of universities in Scotland, I think 15, if I'm not mistaken, we had 12 participating universities, and University of Edinburgh has been actually eliminated from the start because it would have been a potential conflict of interest. So we had 23 semi-structured interviews. And also we've observed meetings of research ethics committees, 6 meetings at 6 different universities. So just a very broad view of our findings. So there is actually a lot of variety and some consistency in how research ethics committees operate across Scottish universities. Of course, this one is not necessarily a good or a bad thing, because universities have a very different profile. They can be geographically spread and so on. So of course, there should be some variety. However, there is some variety that is not always necessarily a good thing. So for instance, what the committees is formed of, do they have an external member or not? How do they recruit their members? Do they allocate some work? Do they have some workload allocation, some time allocation in their role and so on? So that varied quite a lot amongst universities. Also in terms of how people understand the remit of their committee, varied quite a lot. So some committees were looking at health and safety, data management, information management. So pretty much everything without necessarily having the expertise, whereas others were actually looking only at ethical issues. The thing is that most of the REC members were saying that they want to look only at ethical issues, but they weren't given the chance because nobody else was looking at the other ones. And again, it varied quite a bit when it came to different disciplines, different schools and different departments. And of course, this one brought a lot of variety in how the ethics review content was being done. Also, there is a little bit of variety in terms of the operating system. So most of the universities now have some sort of an online system, some better than others, some made by some applicants, which was a very interesting thing because they just got desperate with the email and paper-based system, but there are still some committees that are still operating using an email and paper-based, and they got at times quite frustrated by this because there was a huge amount of time just going back and forth when there were documents that were missing or any kind of information they needed, and people didn't know that they had to submit. However, there is a lot of consistency as well. So in terms of ethics governance, in how the structure and how ethics committees are structured, usually at the top, there is a university research ethics committee. This one usually has the remit of just making policies, training materials, sometimes looking at appeals and auditing as well. So just looking how the individual committees are doing their work, is there consistency out there, how can quality assurance be made, and so on. And of course, the school and departments recs. In some cases though, when universities weren't so much research intensive, there was just one per whole university, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we've seen some examples of extremely good practice where there was only one committee and they were doing the whole job. But again, the university was much smaller. Also, there is a relative consistency in terms of learning how to do the role, most of the time by observing colleagues, by doing the job. So just learn while you go. Relative consistency in terms of ethics reviewing. So most people were doing kind of the same, and how the decision was taken, what constitutes a good and a poor application. So if you would go at another university with your own project, it's very possible that they will consider it relatively the same as the one that initially reviewed it. And relative consistency in terms of what are the areas that people identify as being potentially good for improvement. So just answering those kind of questions, what goes well, what doesn't go so well, and what can be improved. First of all, what goes so well? Overall, there is a sense, actually a very strong sense, that research ethics committees are doing well. So there isn't a big need for reform or for major changes. They are working actually quite well, but there are still some areas for improvement. There is an increased awareness about the importance of ethics approvals and of culture of ethics, which is, I think, compared to about 10 years ago, is a very, very big achievement. Also, there is a massive sense of enjoyment being a member of these committees, and lots of people were commenting about the intellectual challenge that this role brings, also about the sense of collegiality, and also people were saying that they learn actually about the kind of research is being done at their university that otherwise they wouldn't know. Is nowhere published, nowhere made public. So they were quite happy to see how innovative, how brilliant ideas people can bring forward, and they really appreciated this. And this was because they were reviewing these applications, at times extremely challenging from an ethical point of view as well. Also, the ethics review has become actually much more robust and fit for purpose. So in other words, is actually more aligned with research requirements. Also, there is a very strong sense that there is some support from higher up structures and from administrative departments, which I think is a good thing. Also, other things that are going really quite well is that research ethics committees have actually an important advisory role. This is how they perceive themselves, an advisory role for applicants and the university culture more broadly, and they see themselves as actually being stewards in how to navigate the system. And we are coming back to that idea of research governance as well, at times extremely labyrinthine, depending on the complexity of research, of course, how to identify and address ethical challenges and issues. And at times people do not identify them all. It's just normal to be like that. And how to improve research design and methodology. And I know, especially for the social sciences where I'm coming from, that this has been such a massive tension. Do not let the committee to go into your research design and methodology. However, all the participants in our project were saying, we will not take a decision based on this. So if we identify that the project is not so strong, maybe we will make some, just some advices, some suggestions, some comments, but we will not reject that application. If there is a PhD student or an early career researcher, then we would talk to the supervisor and say, because this can actually pose an institutional risk as well. If it is not strongly enough or is a little bit dodgy from this point of view, from a research design and methodology, and somebody identified, they feel it is their responsibility to bring it forward. Also, another very good thing is that there is a change in attitude towards ethics committees and members. And in the past, there was a lot of resistance, a lot of frustration, a lot of comments about the job they were doing. There was also commenting about the difference between senior staff being a little bit more reluctant in applying for ethics committees, at times trying to get their research in such a way that wouldn't go for the committee. So that difference is not seen so strongly anymore, which is a very good thing. Also, they felt that the applicants had this gratitude, respect, and they valued the REC's opinions. But there are a few things that don't go so well, unfortunately. So, for instance, when it comes to being a member of research ethics committees, there is a lot of time commitment. So it's not actually only sometimes just 10 minutes when you discuss. It can actually take a very long time. So it's very time consuming. However, in lots of cases, people do not get the time. So they are doing it in their free time. So that is a very big problem. Also, it's a big problem in terms of who can come forward being a REC member. Is it those people who are actually not so research intensive, who don't have to worry very much about their career advancement? Are there more senior staff? So there could be a problem over there. Also, it's not very easy to source reviewers, again, because they have many other commitments. Also, there is an overlap, at times duplicating reviews, at times some part of the research remaining completely not looked at because there isn't a clear demarcation between research ethics and research governance. So those kind of structures definitely need to be much clearer. Also, in terms of training and learning opportunities, REC members feel they don't have enough, especially when it comes to experience exchange and online system, even though everybody wants it, it's not all very easy to get it. So that's another problem. So how can we do better? Sorry if the writing is a little bit small. I realized it a little bit too late after I sent the presentation. So in terms of workload allocation, this one really should be recognized. So it's not a role that people should do it in their own free time. This one should be somehow built into their role, and not as administrative, because doing actually this kind of review is not administrative work, even though there is a lot of administration in that as well, but it's something more to do like a peer review, should be recognized. How? So should be recognized as well being a REC member in terms of career advancement. Also should definitely each REC have an external and lay members, because most of our participants were talking actually how an amazing added value they have to their committees. They really bring such a fresh perspective at times just by questioning, why are you doing like that one like that? Why are you asking applicants to do that? So even that kind of thing, just by having a critical eye or a curious eye, can improve things. But at times it's quite difficult to source these lay and external members. So that is something that needs to be improved. Also in terms of sourcing reviewers, because as I was mentioning, it's quite difficult at times to find somebody who's very involved into just publishing, doing research, doing teaching as well, and so all these kind of things. So what we've suggested is actually, because there are lots of people, PhD students, early career researchers, all these people who are actually applying for ethics, they should be involved as well, maybe as reviewers or as observers, so they can make some observations about what can be done a little bit better, what works, what doesn't, and they can actually fill that gap into their own training as well, getting very accustomed with the importance of research ethics committees, but also of how things are done. So that could be one of the solutions. Other suggestions for further improvement, more training and learning resources, both for reviewers and for applicants. So for instance, for applicants, maybe some built-in instructions like the integrated research application system that is used by HRA, Health Research Authority. definitely should be obtained the online system for everyone. Very clear cut between ethics and research governance, not to have those kind of duplicating things, and an overview organization, because we ask people, what do you think? Do you think an overview organization would do things better, can manage things for you, make these kind of things? And they already felt that the sector is already overly regulated, so they didn't want anymore. Not something like that, not an overview organization. So this is what we've proposed as an alternative. So the alternative is actually a collaborative network. So it is supportive and not prescriptive. So it doesn't come with more regulation. Everybody from research ethics committees, all the members can come on a voluntary membership, only if they want to be part of it. And it would have this model of peer support, where people can actually share examples of good practice, example of bad practice, because sometimes can be, and I think James was talking about this as well. Templates as well of supporting documentation, because I think at times some universities are doing better with certain kind of groups. They have some absolutely brilliant participant information sheets or informed consent forms, all these kind. So they could share this one. So it can be a little bit more of an exchange there. Also, they can share all sorts of discussion and expert advice. And that problem that we identified as not being very easy to identify lay and external members, would also, this kind of collaboration, this kind of collaborative network can make a pool of external members, because some can be more resourceful than others. And we called it that. It doesn't have to be like that. Scottish University Alliance for Research Ethics Governance, a little bit pompous, a little bit long, another acronym, SWAREG, but could be something that could potentially work. And we know, and we identify that at the moment, there isn't anything like that for research ethics committees. So that's me, thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Christina. Very interesting. And just for information of colleagues here, we've actually got a meeting of the Scottish University's Research and Knowledge Exchange Committee in the afternoon. So a number of the things that are being discussed here will actually go to Pro-Vice-Chancellor's research, Vice Principal and so on. So it will get discussed, and we'll be also very interested in the questions that you're asking. Anyway, I'll move on now. I'm delighted to welcome from across Glasgow, Miles Padgett.
Down arrow works. That's great. Right. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak. It's a delight not to have to travel to London. I just merely hopped on the Clockwork Orange and was here in 5 minutes. So that was great. So I am a member of the UK Committee on Research Integrity. And I'm going to say a few words about that. And then I did warn someone this morning that my slides were content-free. And I'm then going to just do something a little bit different. And I'm taken with James's last comment. I can read Twitter, I can read whatever, and I can read all of the terrible things that happen, and that's bad, okay? And if you're not careful, we get caught in that loop. And I'm a researcher, as Jim was saying, and what interests me is ideas. Now, not all ideas are good ideas. I know that all too clearly, but ideas that people can respond to. And you go, what would happen if? And how can we make a change? Because if we don't do anything different, nothing different will happen. In fact, it will just sort of carry on going and things will just get worse. So what are we actually going to change? Now, the other thing to say is we're here and we're talking about research integrity because it's really important to us. And somewhere else, there's a lecture theatre full of people and they're talking about how to improve the impact of research and its impact on the UK economy. There's another group of people which are talking about public engagement. There's another different group of people, which is how on earth are we going to balance the books of our university? I was just reading on the BBC News pages, we see a university down in East Anglia, not Cambridge, the other one, is making some staff cuts because they can't balance their books. And so there's all these pressures, there's all these dimensions. So my challenge is, you may think that we have to change 30 things, but we can't change 30 things, not on this agenda. We can change 3 things on this agenda. What are they going to be? And I think that's the real question. Right, that's me speaking as me, not as UKCORI. So UKCORI is chaired by, co-chaired, so you sort of do as you think should be done. It's a really neat idea. We don't have 1 chair, we have 2 chairs, and they take it in turns to chair agenda items. Actually, do you know what? Works really well. And I would recommend that to anyone thinking of setting up a committee. You know, and then it's usually hard work chairing a committee because you're not as well prepared as you think you should be, and you're desperately trying to keep ahead of the agenda. This is brilliant, because while one person is addressing one agenda item, you can be thinking merrily about how you're going to handle the next agenda item, given what's happened in the meeting so far. So if you go away from today with one idea, here's an idea, have a co-chair of a meeting. And that's who they are. And again, I'm just going to say, what do I find interesting here? I sit on lots of committees where people are basically just clones of each other. I mean that in the nicest sense of the word. And I don't just mean by way of diversity. Clearly, there's massive problems there. But even then, when you've looked beyond that, actually, we all have exactly the same skill set. I know a lot about quantum optics. You know a lot about classical optics. You know a lot about integrated optics. I mean, my goodness, how does the world continue? What's fascinating with this committee is it actually comes from completely different backgrounds. So I may have an understanding about what data means in my discipline. I have no idea what data means if I do theatre and TV studies, but I do now because I've listened. Okay, when I talk about open, just a little, I mean, again, I'm just a little bit of a tangential thought. Transparency. We're going to talk a little bit later about transparency is always a good thing. Transparency of the data, transparency of the methods. You know, I use a data repository. And then I was talking to somebody on this committee, and they were talking about a lot of their research is interview-based, that they're interviewing film directors, for example, about something. And if that person thought that their interview was going to be put on some data repository verbatim, they'd clearly be saying a lot less than they're going to say to you. And so what does open data look like in that situation? Because you can't just put the interviews verbatim on some data repository. Is it the questions that constitute open data? These were the questions I was exploring. And then is it some kind of coalition of their responses? Now, I'm not saying what's right or wrong, but I got it straight away that this is more complicated than simply putting my Excel spreadsheets on some hard drive somewhere and letting someone else access the numbers that I'd read from my spectrometer. And so open data clearly looks different in different disciplines. And it's interesting. Right. So the remit of the Committee on Research Integrity, which is a little bit contentious, because no doubt some people felt, in fact, some people maybe on the select committee felt, that this Committee on Research Integrity was going to investigate research misconduct. And maybe it should be, maybe we're wrong. But I'm just going to say there's a limit to the amount of research misconduct that 10 people can investigate on an annual basis. My horrible experience is that you'd probably end up investigating 3 cases, and that would be your full-time job. So clearly 10 people are not the answer to investigations of misconduct. And at this point, can I just say, I sat next to James coming in this morning. James, I'll thank you again now in public. Back in a previous role, when it was my responsibility to investigate, your organization offered fantastic advice in very difficult situations. And so I applaud you for the support that you've offered the community in that. And indeed the framework you set up for what misconduct should look like, but also the specific advice. Now, back to our committee. In May 2023, we will publish a document and it will be an annual statement on research integrity, and which we're merrily all drafting at the moment. And I hope that that document fundamentally will have ideas in it. And what I hope this document will do would be, what happens if we do this? What happens if we do that? And appreciating the unintended consequences is important, you know. And I remember talking about, on a slightly tangential topic, about, you know, we need to get more transparency, we need to get more visibility to the career destinations of the people who I mentor. And my research students, my RAs, what do they go on to do? What difference will they, how have I supported them in helping them realize their goals? This sounds very, very sensible. Until, of course, it's pointed out to me that if I know I'm going to be held for account for that, maybe that influences the people I might choose to recruit. Maybe I'll just go for the safe recruitments because I don't want to spoil my batting average. If I was to use a cricketing analogy, I only want to play on the easy wickets. So, okay, there's an unintended consequence. Don't know what the solution is, but it's important. So, so you can get ready to get your tomatoes ready. I'm proud to say that I chaired one of the sub-panels in the last rep exercise. You can now pelt me with tomatoes. And of course, I will answer all questions about why I didn't score that particular paper of yours a 4-star output. And you think about what levers do you have at disposal, mechanism for change and all that kind of stuff. And if you want to change the world, 10% of the people will agree with you and they'll just come along with your suggestion and they'll do it, no matter the difficulties that you put in place, no matter how bad the web interface is, they will spend the 20 hours uploading their data so other people can access it. And it will throw them off every 3 minutes and they'll have to start again from scratch. And there's 10% of people that are never going to do it. And the vast majority agree with you, they just don't have time. So, and they'll come with you as long as you make it easy. And I'll now give an advert for our library at Glasgow. When I get a paper accepted, or when a member of our team gets a paper accepted, they get an email that goes, well done, we're going to publish you. All we have to do at Glasgow is forward that email to the library, and everything else takes care of itself. The publisher's paid. The PDF ends up on Enlighten, our repository. You get hounded over the data, which is fine. I understand that. Where's the data? Where's the data? But the reason why Glasgow has such a high compliance when it comes to open access is not because we're somehow superhuman. It's because our library made it really easy for people to comply. And I thank them for that. And I think that's the key to compliance, by the way. You make it easy. But you can't make everything easy, so you have to pick and choose. So I am a fan of REF. Get more tomatoes. I think it has changed things for better. So actually, I'm going to disagree with something that James said, if I may, just for a bit of contention. You said people are more interested in quantity, not quality. Actually, I don't think that's true anymore. Now, we may have a misguidance as to what quality means. I accept that. But actually, no one has, in decades, has asked me, Miles, how many papers have you published? No one cares. Not even I care. What they ask me is, what's the best 4 papers you published? Okay, that's a little bit sad as well. But it is actually about the best things you've done, not the volume. So I think REF has driven a responsibility that we all share to show that our research needs to have impact on society. I think actually that's transformed academic mindset. And I've done REF in some overseas places. And you see that change in mindset when it's introduced to the academic community, just as I think it was here. But somehow it's more visible, having made the change ourselves, when it's introduced in Hong Kong. And they're all going, what? My research has to be useful? And you're going, eh? Of course it has. I think REF was a fantastic lever for open access. The fact that you had to have, you know, whatever it was, I mean, you can tell me, 85%, I can't remember what the guidance was, 85% open access of the return. something like that, of the eligible, yeah. It was transformational. And I asked myself in terms of future ref, and I know Lizzie has written on this as well, you know, author contribution statements. It seems such a no-brainer to me that we mandate that in a future ref exercise. And I can't see what the bad things would be that would result from that. And I can see lots of good things. A data availability statement. Again, what would be the downside of having to have a data availability statement? And even if you said there is no data associated with this work, it's a work of creative poetry or whatever, or it's a mathematical proof and the whole thing's here, there is no data, that's fine, but just an acknowledgement. And all of those statements that you read that goes like, there is no data available for this thing, but it's available upon reasonable request. I mean, that's a disgraceful data availability statement, shouldn't be allowed, but you know, what would be the bad things? I'm also intrigued, again, good and bad, when it comes to outputs and notes of concern and retractions. And, you know, those of us that follow Elizabeth Bick's Twitter feed or whatever, or what she writes, and you see this horrendous prevalence of duplicated images, of photoshopped copy and pasted images. And those are the easy ones to catch. I mean, think about all the people that are actually copying and pasting from their library of images rather than from within their own paper. I mean, the mind boggles as to the extent of that. But finding that there's something wrong in a manuscript that's copy and pasted is different from going, and that person was responsible. That's a much harder ask. Is it right or wrong that we just move to, I've lost confidence? I saw that, was it Science Magazine wrote an editorial thing recently on how there's going to be a third category of papers that the editor has lost confidence in. I have doubts about this paper. It's a note of concern. I'm not making an accusation. I'm not saying who was responsible, but for the sake of the integrity of the scientific records, we need to flag up that something is not right with this paper. Now, that's not a full-blown investigation, but is it something that we should be embracing more of? Again, I'm sure people have different views on that. On misconduct, and whether there should be a national body that investigates it or whether there should be a national appeals body. And I know that I was chatting with, I think, Lizzie again this morning, said, well, what about Australia? And yeah, Australia do that. I would love to see the evidence or otherwise that leads to a better system than at the moment we're in a system where essentially HEIs are responsible for their own investigations. Personally, I think I probably prefer the latter. Maybe I'm wrong. But I do think it then falls on the HEIs to have a transparency statement, an assurance statement, an annual assurance statement to say that last year we investigated X cases, Y of them were found to be upheld, and the details of those cases within the context of confidentiality were such and such. 3 of them were image manipulation, 1 of them was plagiarism, whatever that might be. So I do think that there should be an annual assurance statement, and I think that's something that the funding council should take on. I think it should be a requirement of the outcome agreement. So that's that. So I'm just going to finish now. I saw Tim make that little move to thank you all and urge us to think of solutions, not solely recognizing the problem, recognizing also that the number of those solutions that we can actually implement are finite. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Miles. And yeah, there's recognize a lot of the things you're saying there. And I think in particular, that point of what can we do that's easy for people to implement, and just choosing a smaller number of things that we can really focus on are really, really important lessons for us. So finally, let me welcome Lizzie. Don't forget to be getting your questions up.
Right. Thank you very much. Really great to be here. Let's see if I can control the slides. No, I think is the answer. Yeah. Brilliant. Okay. A very good morning to you all. My name is Lucy Gadd. I work at Loughborough University in the UK in research policy. My pronouns are she, her. I am also the chair of the INORMS Research Evaluation Group and have recently been elected the vice chair of the Coalition on Advancing Research Assessment. And today I'm going to be focusing on 7 priorities for improving research culture through research assessment, because I think there's no doubt that so many of our research culture problems that we've heard about this morning result from poor and narrowly focused assessments that reward the wrong things and intensify competition in unhelpful ways. Let me just put my notes there so that I can work this. Brilliant. Okay, so to inform what I'm going to say, I'm going to be drawing on 3 main sources. Firstly, the agreement on reforming research assessment, overseen by the Coalition on Advancing Research Assessment, slightly different. That was established in December 2022. Secondly, the independent review on indicators, infrastructures and priorities for responsible research assessment in the UK, harnessing the metric tide. Again, that was launched in December 22. It was a very busy month. And thirdly, the INORMS Research Evaluation Group's scope framework for responsible research evaluation. So if you want to Google those, I'm sure you'll find them. So over the last 10 years, we have had a whole raft of principles, declarations and manifestos in the responsible research assessment space. In the UK, I think we've really grasped the nettle here. And in England, at least, it's now part of the terms and conditions for QR funding that you will adhere to these sorts of principles. But you don't have to spend too long on Twitter before you come across someone disillusioned with the assessment practices of their organisation that are seemingly in contravention of their own policy, including last year a pretty high-profile case of a DORA signatory using citation metrics to identify individuals for redundancy. Hence our first priority now, I think, being the need to put our principles into practice. And this was the first of the 10 recommendations of harnessing the metric tide. And the reason why 6 of the last 6 of the 10 commitments in the agreement on reforming research assessment relate to actually putting the first 4 into practice, you know, to practice it, to share it, to publish it, to share best practice with others. And one thing I've observed here that I think we particularly need to work on is that whilst there's a lot of activity around valuing a broader range of things in our assessments now, what we're not so good at is putting enough value on those things so that they actually make a difference. There's no point measuring what matters if we're still heavily weighting the things that don't. So we add on open research and collegiality expectations to our promotions criteria without any proper plans to assess them or even the means to do that. And we add a raft of research culture indicators to existing research KPIs in the hope that it will magically usher in this new utopian research culture. It won't. You know, you already have a research culture and it's embodied in your existing research KPIs. Adding new ones without displacing or at least reweighting your old ones won't do anything, you know, unless you start to use those research culture indicators to allocate funding to your schools, unless the fabulous leader with the gift for public engagement beats the highly cited bully with a raft of Nature publications in a promotions contest. Because it's not just what we value that matters, but what we don't value that we need to specify. A good friend said to me once, and she's sitting in this room, research culture is defined by the worst behaviour you're prepared to tolerate. You know, if we're going to let someone's grant income record excuse their toxic behaviours, our research culture KPIs aren't worth paper they're written on. We need to actually put our principles into practice, practice what we can preach, and find ways of doing that, which leads me on to my next point, which is to use data for good. Because in order to measure what matters, we need a way of actually measuring what matters. And I think this is one thing the evaluation community is really grappling with at the moment. You know, we get Campbell's law. We know that what we measure is what we get, but we have no real means of measuring the things we want to get. So just try to evaluate your institution's uptake of open research data, as Miles was talking about earlier, in any meaningful way. How can you compare the leadership qualities of candidates or their commitment to research integrity? You know, it's hard to do that. And nothing will keep us tethered to pounds and publications in our evaluation approaches, like the sheer plethora of the ways to evaluate those things relative to the other things we're now seeking to recognise and reward. So another one of the harnessing the metric tide recommendations was exactly this, to recognise that while the term metrics have got a bad name for themselves by becoming synonymous with bibliometrics, metrics can also have significant constitutive effects if they seek to surface the things that we care about, gender and ethnicity pay gaps, research staff on short-term contracts, and so on. Of course, any new indicators will need to be developed with the communities under evaluation and in line with a proper evaluation framework like SCOPE to ensure that there are no unintended consequences, as Miles was mentioning. But I feel like agreement on the dimensions of research culture that we can usefully monitor and how could be a major step forward for helping us improve. Having said that, my third priority might seem like a contradiction of my previous one. But so whilst I do believe that using data for good would help us to monitor and improve important dimensions of research culture, I also think that overall, in the interests of research culture, we need to measure far less. You know, yes, assessment does drive behavioural change, you get what you measure, but it's not the only or the best way of driving all behavioural change. And whilst it's tempting to think if you just measure the right things, everything will come good, sometimes it's measuring itself that takes the toll. You know, as any research culture survey will tell you, this is the Wellcome Trust one, metrics are featured heavily, and as any academics will tell you. And that's why one of the principles of the INORMS scope framework is to evaluate only where necessary. That's a bit small, but you can Google it. We don't always need to evaluate. And when we do, we need to be careful how we do it. Because to my mind, research culture and integrity are hygiene factors. You know, those fundamental requirements for health and well-being, like recycling and health and safety regulations, without which things can go badly wrong, but the pursuit of which isn't really going to get us out of bed in the morning. And the way that we tend to assess hygiene factors in the workplace is not through rankings and reward schemes, recycler of the week, you know, but through basic audit, boring checks that the standards are being met and that the necessary processes are in place. No anxiety-inducing incentives to be the best at research culture, you know, but serious disincentives for not making the grade. Because the last thing that we want is a research culture to become the next big competition in higher education. Because where there's a prize, there's a game, and research culture is too important to game. You know, research culture expectations just need to become the norm. My fourth priority for a better research culture is to genuinely and deeply care about equity in our evaluative processes and beyond those dimensions protected by law. So another one of the 5 steps of the INORMS scope framework for responsible evaluation is to probe deeply for discriminatory effects and unintended consequences. And again, it's one of the things we recommended in harnessing the metric tide, that we run equality impact assessments on our evaluations. And once you consider the equality impacts, the dimensions of our evaluations, you know, it becomes pretty clear what we need to do. So when someone asks whether they can promote the research.com best scientist rankings, just show them a picture of the top 10. Pretty straightforward. Or whether we could use editorships of 4-star journals as esteem indicators. Just create a word cloud of the journal editors' names, as this person has. Or whether we should incorporate SciVal data in our global talent search, just to show them the locations of the journals that SciVal indexes, 81% from the global north. Or whether we should use rankings to identify high potential individuals for UK visas, just show them which great swathes of the world this excludes and how the majority of the world's Black and brown people live there, and then see whether that fits with any notion of equity. Because we either care about equity, diversity, and inclusion, or we don't. We can't pick and choose when this matters. And I know this is a tough message. It's hard to be confronted with our own privilege. No one sets out to do any harm, I get that. But when we are confronted with our own privilege, when something that we saw as a meritocracy actually just turns out to be the result of a whole series of structural biases, we have to own that, as painful as it is. We can't sit back and perpetuate a lie, even when that lie works in our favour. And for UK and US institutions in particular, this is a tough one to swallow, I get it. Because when we look at the names and the faces and the countries that repeatedly win in these structurally biased evaluations, they are our names and faces and countries. But accept it we must. And of course, we know this isn't new. We've been banging on about inequalities in citation data and rankings for years, but usually these concerns just find their way into a list of caveats and limitations that accompany our assessments. What we've not done adequately, in my view, is to clarify at what point the inequities in our evaluation methods outweigh any justification for running that evaluation in the first place. When do we say no? And given saying no to poor evaluation approaches usually falls to poor, beleaguered, underpaid research managers and librarians, like many in this room, how do we support our colleagues to say no? And it was because saying no, especially to university rankings, on which our financial and reputational future still depends, unfortunately, in the UK and in many parts of the world, is very hard, that the INORMS Research Evaluation Group introduced the More Than Our Rank initiative to provide an opportunity for both the institutions that win and the institutions that don't in our wonky ranking systems to join together and say, look, the rankings are what they are. They work for some, they don't work for others. But all of us, both highly ranked and those yet to place, have more to offer the world than is the things that are currently captured in the global university rankings. And one of the recommendations of harnessing the metric tide was that institutions sign up to More Than Our Rank for this reason. And I think this leads nicely on to my fifth priority, which is to start shifting away from so much backward-looking summative assessment that judges where we were, in REF's case, 7 or 8 years ago, to more formative forms of assessment that help us move forward. You know, I've always thought that given REF prides itself on being a peer review process, it's ironic that the only thing institutions are left with at the end of it are spreadsheets full of numbers and maybe about 5 lines of written feedback per unit of assessment. To my mind, this has to change, you know, and I think this is entirely in line with the cultural shifts that we need to see away from this scholarship for glory thing, you know, ratified by accept and reject decisions embodied in versions of record, and towards scholarship for knowledge and discovery, an open peer review conversation with a record of versions, to use Bianca Kramer's phrase. There'd be no incentive to generate paper-milled articles or to be added as a gift author on a journal article if all the authors got in return was some formative feedback, you know, rather than a summative accept or reject decision in a shiny journal. You know, many of our evaluations give an air of concrete certainty, as though it's actually possible to identify an acceptable paper, the best researcher, the best institution, when there is no such truth. Best at what? You know, we need to embrace more qualitative, discursive, nuanced, formative forms of evaluation that seek to improve research rather than judge it. And to my mind, this includes REF, and I've long argued for a Dutch strategy evaluation protocol approach, which works very well for the Dutch. You know, assessors are not locked in rooms judging outputs, but are actually visiting institutions, breathing their research air, and advising them how they might improve. Now, I'm aware that I've been listing a whole host of edicts here, mainly aimed at universities, but we do have to remember that universities only measure because they're measured, you know, and evaluators are everywhere. We have the REF, of course, we have program accreditations, we have funder audits, we have the rankings we talked about, we have data sources which are largely based on publications. So whilst the finger is often pointed at institutions to value a broader range of things, it's extremely difficult to do this when you're being assessed on a very narrow range of things by a whole host of third-party evaluators. So for this reason, another one of the harnessing the metric tide recommendations was to give the UK Forum for Responsible Research Metrics a renewed and expanded remit as the Forum for Responsible Research Assessment, with a particular responsibility for engaging with third-party evaluators to lobby for synchronization across the ecosystem. And of course, if we're going to engage with third parties, we have to do so globally, because research evaluation, like research itself, is a global endeavour. And whilst fixing the way we assess research in the UK or even in Europe is not going, it's important, but it's not going to help our researchers when they want to move globally and they find out the things they were pursuing to build their research career here are completely undervalued elsewhere. And that's why CoARA, although born out of Europe, was from the outset intended to be an international coalition. And this is something we're going to be seeking to bake in with our first round of working groups. But I don't think we should be naive about the challenges here. You know, there's significant variation globally around institutional autonomy, government ambitions, research culture, and many individuals, institutions, and governments that have invested in seeking to improve against traditional measures, not surprisingly, are less than happy when the goalposts look like they're being shifted, even when the ambition is to shift them in their favour, and especially when the drive to do so seems to come from without rather than from within. And that's why I've added this as my final priority. So that's me. 7 priorities for improving research culture through research assessment, summarised here in a single slide. Thank you so much for your attention. Look forward to continuing.
Thank you for that, really stimulating. We've gone slightly over the timing that we had programmed. So what we'll do is, if you don't mind, we'll also allow the meeting to go on slightly longer. Those who are watching from elsewhere, of course, you're free to go and make your cup of tea whenever you want to, and we'll not know about that. Can I invite our speakers up to the session?
Let's just check these are all working. That's good.
Check this, yeah, working too.
Thank you. And you have some questions, I think, which have been posed by the audience.
So we've had some questions come in from Mentimeter already. There have been quite a few around the same theme, and I think you could all spend all day talking about this, and we all could. So I'm going to take one version of the question and say, how do you create an enabling environment for good research practice? And just a top one, I think one thing you would recommend doing, I think, from each speaker, because otherwise we won't get to lunch or any other questions.
Okay, well, let's run down Lizzie first.
Thank you. Off the top of my head, we need to start with what we value. You know, we need to get much better at understanding what it is that we actually value, what we actually care about, what really matters to us as institutions, and from there decide what the processes, policies, procedures, approaches that we need to take need to be that kind of help us deliver on those values. But I just don't think we do that enough as institutions. We don't really. We talked about, I think it was Jim was mentioning his the values of this university at the outset. But how does that actually? I call those super values, these single words. You know, integrity, collegiality. What do you mean by that? How you know how will that translate into actually delivering on those values? I think that's what I would do.
Thank you. I'd go back to something I said, which there should be no stigma attached to needing help. I think researchers as a profession were about finding things out, you know, discovering data, collating it, inventing new things. And so I think there's always a kind of professional mindset. We should always know the answers ourselves. And that can lead to problems festering because we don't feel we can speak out. That can lead to setbacks being seen as failures, you know, oh, my results are negative and being knocked back by this stuff. I think as individuals, we need to be good colleagues and listen to recognize that other people often need our help and encourage people to speak up. And ourselves, don't be afraid to say, I'm stuck, I don't know what to do. And managers and leadership from the top down need to create time and spaces for that type of environment to flourish.
Thank you. Just thinking probably just about our project on research ethics committees. I think most of the time we demonize them a lot, and they need actually more support because they are quite a lot caught between different kind of regulations and different expectations from applicants. So I think even though they are this kind of interface, they need more support. So how we do that kind of support, there are, like we've suggested, there could be something that can be improved. So in terms of good practice also, I think there should be more training when it comes to ethics to applicants. Lots of them treat it quite often as just an administrative ticking box exercise. So I think it should be more awareness of the importance of ethics actually for our research career. How important is ethics for different kind of disciplines? Of course, it can be very different, but some of the people really should be aware how important it is. And it is not only an exercise like that, but because it is treated quite often by the committees that are forced to treat it like that, then it can end up actually in forms of bad practice. And I'm not saying that it can be misconduct, but at times can be actually bad practice. So I think improving or enabling good practice should be these kind of things. How can we enable it in such a way that we can avoid treating everything we do as an administrative task?
Well, clearly, I agree with what's been said earlier. Something I wanted to say but didn't, but I think it's pertinent to this thing. We live in an ecosystem at the moment where success rate is 5%, whatever we mean by success, but we could say hyper-competitive. I don't think it's fixable. If you live in a system where it's 5% success rate, bad things happen, pressure, whatever. And I don't know, having said that, it's easy to discuss the problem and not the solution. Let me say, I don't know what the solution to that problem is, but that is, I think, fundamental.
That's certainly a challenge. Maybe I could just make a point here, actually, because you talked about the values. And I think what's the immediate thing I thought was, well, yeah, you have to live the values, and those values live through the actions that you take. But actually, for institutions, it's very difficult for us to sometimes make public some of the actions that we take. And I think that probably applies much more broadly. It applies in particular to those values, but it applies more broadly. And I think there are things where we've made some positive interventions to improve our research culture by, let's say, excluding some parts of some contributions. And those are things that we can't as institutions very easily talk about because of all the other kinds of constraints that we have. And maybe one of the things we need to be thinking about is how we could find ways to bring those out more into public discussion, I think, because also both positive and negative stories contribute, as you say, to what that research culture is. So let's
cheekily interject and say UKRIO publishes anonymous case studies of good practice. Or if you want to put your name, anyone wants to put their names on, again, we'll take that as well.
That's great. Thank you.
That leads really well into one of the questions that I was going to ask next that's come in from the Mentimeter. And James, he's just started answering, but actually to give the rest of the panel a chance to answer it, is how do we learn from mistakes and near misses when they don't get published? So, I think that came in really during your talk, James, when thinking about the research fraud, but actually in general, I think following on from very much what Tim just asked as well, it'd be good to hear from all of the panel about that, about what can we do to address that.
Who wants to go first? Do you want to go first, Miles? No.
I'll pass the microphone. How do we learn? Lizzie said something, I think, which is really important. Well, many things which are important, but one of the things important that you said was in relation to like the assurance statement, the publication. It's not a question of whether my assurance statement is better than your assurance statement. It's whether the assurance statements have met a minimum an acceptable standard. And without wanting to think that it's a simple silver bullet, I'll say it again. I think every university should publish an annual assurance statement regarding research misconduct. And I think having that should be a requirement for, let's say, entry to ref or whatever that might be. It's not a scored element. It is just, these are things that you must do in the same way you would do in relation to health and safety. And I think getting that baseline is important.
Okay.
I've got something to say.
Just I suppose a practitioner perspective on this, and depending on exactly what's meant by the question, but I was just reflecting that what I found very helpful is to develop communities of practice is a very practical solution. You know, very small, closed, known groups, often geographically based, of colleagues / friends who you can trust with your difficult stories and your difficult circumstances, to try and get some advice and come to some consensus as to what might be the best way forward in that situation. I think that could be enormously formative, because you can't put it on a discussion list. You can't kind of go public with a lot of this stuff, but it's real, and it's often borne by those who are not particularly senior, actually. So I think having those communities of practice can just give you confidence to yes, this is an issue that needs addressing. This is how we might go about it, but actually I think you do need to go and get some kind of more senior input in that situation. It can just be enormously helpful, I think.
I'll go very quickly, a couple of points. Firstly, I agree with what's been said by both Miles and Lizzie. Also, in terms of high-level summaries of research misconduct investigations, universities are already mandated to produce those. There are questions about how quickly they're doing it, but they do have limitations of employment law and also fears of getting sued if they put out too much information. In terms of sharing good practice, I think the idea of networks is very good. I'm going to big up Glasgow. It's in other universities, with our help, have set up local networks of research integrity champions. If you go to our website, there's guidance on how to set those up, and case studies from Glasgow, and I think about 4 or 5 other universities, and another Glasgow place, the Cancer Research UK Beatson Institute, also in Glasgow. So lots of interesting case studies there. I think sharing good practice in anonymized or open form is really important. And I'll be a bit cheeky, actually. UKRIO is a charity. We're supported by volunteers. We have an advisory community of volunteers. And if these discussions today have kind of fired you up and thinking, well, what can I do to help? Come to our website. We're always looking for more people.
Yes, when I'm thinking again about research ethics committees, one of the things that we asked our participants was, so after you give your approval and people are going and doing their research, are you following up? And most of them were actually saying, no, we don't do that. First of all, it's not our remit. Second of all, we don't want actually researchers to feel like we police them. However, there could be cases, of course, of misconduct. People can say, this is what I'm doing, just so they can obtain the approval. And then when they go in the field, they still do whatever they want. Probably those cases are very rare, or at least this is what everyone hopes, that people are doing what they said they will be doing, but there is no way actually of finding out about this one. So unless we know about these kind of things, not by policing them necessarily, but having some examples of bad practice, maybe we can just learn what shouldn't be done. Because again, going back to this kind of ethics being part of our research, being part of our research career of who we are, we shouldn't actually really treat it like that. There is massive value to ethics, and not only to ethics as a conduct, but also all of the ethics reviews as well. They just really give guidance on what it is allowed, not to put the institution at risk and so on. So one of the things that we proposed in that kind of collaborative network was actually to share not only examples of good practice, but of bad practice as well, because there are plenty. And again, not through this kind of just, and I think another thing that would be really very interesting was actually even what people intend to do. Because sometimes they might intend to do some things that could be quite dodgy actually. So even those ones could be examples of bad practice. They might intend to do something, then the committee comes back, they tell them, don't do that because it's not ethical. But after they get the approval, they might go back and do it anyway. So how do we learn about those ones, and what can we learn from those? So I think there is massive value to this kind of bad practices.
Okay, we're going to take some questions in the room now. So I've got one here. Is anyone else? Just put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question.
Hi, I'm Maria Ivancheva. I'm an anthropologist as well. I'm also a member, one of the only humanities and social sciences members of the ethics committee at this university. I'm from the School of Education. And I have a couple of concerns, maybe rather than questions, and you can decide which part of them to treat as questions. And I really appreciate what you said, and this was probably the most fresh and critical take on ethics that I've listened to at universities, but I think we should push a bit further. And one of the concerns is about, we're always speaking about ethics as if they're somehow very benevolent towards our participants. And we are kind of bearing this bad karma of medical and experimental psychological sciences about misleading informants. But there are a lot of sciences like ours that don't do that kind of stuff, that interact with the immediate environment. And we are sitting on ethical committees still that are first protective of institutions and protective of states, where we are interviewing vulnerable communities, but we have to be accountable to states and to universities about that. So there's still a lot of disquiet in some of our sciences about how do we account about good practice, given that we have to respond to ethics committees where the concerns come from completely different sorts of inquiry. And so the second question is related more to research careers, and some of you touched upon those. So the question about ethics is sometimes about how do we as researchers act in an ethical way within our own projects, and that is almost never addressed. So we're dealing, and I'm part of groups and networks. I'm also, I'm the president of the European Association of Social Anthropology, on the basis of complaints that were made by precarious researchers about heavy abuse by PIs of data that has been collected by them, authorship that is not given to them, and so on and so forth. So all these ethical codes are completely kind of sidelined, and the only questions that are asked in most of these panels are how are you going to treat informants, human subjects. So, and we did, on the basis of that, even produce a guideline of ethical authorship in projects, which deals with the fact that a lot of time, I mean, here we're speaking about REF and the open access. I mean, a lot of times PIs have the money to pay for golden open access. That's how certain articles can go into REF and others can't. People move their work around and you lose access to data. As postdoc, I was vetoed out of data that I collected because I disagreed politically with my PI. So there are issues there that are bigger than this kind of immediate concern. And my question is, what do we do to address them?
Well, who would like to make a start on that? Cristina, maybe to start on the ethics side.
Yeah, so I think the first question is actually something that is still not resolved. And I think one of the biggest issues is that some of the committees, we fear that they have been very much modeled after the health research kind of committees, ethics committees. So of course, we can't graft this kind of very flexible in their methodology, in their approach, in their relationship with the participants and so on, these kind of disciplines, just to graft them on something that is actually very strict, and we can put it there very clearly. I'll have 1 minute when I take some blood sample. So it's not kind of the same. That kind of tension still remains. I don't think is so strongly within universities as it is, for instance, when we go to NHS regs. There is a massive problem. We can't fit our researches, we can't fit our projects coming from social sciences in general, but even more with anthropology. And I've struggled massively to get this kind of approval. And at the time I thought it is just my fault, but actually it is a much more structural issue. So I think some committees are more sensitive than others. Depends very much on how big is the university. Do they have some experts from certain kind of disciplines? Of course, there is a problem there because when there is only 1 or only 5, let's say, coming from anthropology, they can't have a permanent member on the ethics committees coming from that kind of discipline. So it needs to be a little bit sort of balanced. So I still think, as an anthropologist myself, I still think there is massive value in having the guidance from research ethics committees. But one of the models that can be proposed is actually how can we trust these researchers and assess that trust that they will do what they will do and they'll behave ethically in the field. Because we still have to be very aware that the institution the institution's name is at risk as well, not only of the individual researcher. So how can we make sure about these kind of things? So this is where I see it. The kind of flexibility when it comes to those kind of, for instance, participant information sheet and informed consent is not always adequate in all contexts. Some people will feel very suspicious giving those kind of documents, and there are examples of that. But again, I think is how we sensitize committees, that actually there should be some flexibility in how different kind of researches, different kind of disciplines can be approached and reviewed. And maybe one of the solutions could be just to have somebody coming from that discipline, just to look at that and say, all right, this is how it is being done. So could be one of the solutions. For the second question, I think somebody else, I don't know if I answered the question. I know it will remain a tension, and probably it will remain for a very long time, how actually social sciences projects, researches are evaluated by research ethics committees, and still will be some tension there. But I think it can be resolved.
Thank you. I think you've covered a challenge within ethics incredibly well there. In regards to the second situation you mentioned, I think it was the second slide I showed, was a snapshot of our advisory service, and publication ethics and authorship. People caught up in the situation you just described have been year on year one of the top two categories of inquiry to UKRIO. For people who find themselves in that situation, don't try and go through it alone, get help. UKRIO is one source of advice for the UK. There are other sources of advice in other countries. I think to solve the problem, there needs to be systemic change, and all the other panelists touched upon that. And I mean, Miles talked about contributed statements. Lizzie mentioned about this is a global issue. It's top-down change from governments downwards in every country, so that we have a long way to go before we get that change. But that's little comfort to people who find themselves in situations like you did, and I'm sorry that you had to face that. There are sources of help for people who are involved in those situations now. And authorship is an incredibly personal issue because it's tied to career progression. It's in academia, it's publish or perish. Other research careers there is a something or perish in every research community. And it's not, for those that don't publish in the way that academics do, it's something else. It can be impact, because there are metrics for that, or perish. I was a rescue archaeologist, and we were funded by developers who ideally didn't want us to find anything, so their planning applications can go through. So that was our or perish. And so those factors there, and you need systemic change. It's going to take time to get there. In the meantime, there are sources of advice and help available to you. So I can guarantee sooner or later, everybody will find themselves either involved in an authorship dispute or know someone who is. Seek help if you run into that problem.
Thank you very much. I think we've got one question left.
Just going to see, anyone else in the room? Yeah, take it in the room.
Hi, I was interested in your views about the varying degree of pressure for informed consent to be fully informed and to have a really nice participant information sheet that's got all the information, and actually participants who don't read it and just tick the box.
Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I think that is another kind of issue that lots of people have. How can we, because when we try to obtain this informed consent, we kind of assume that people will just do it anyway. And we know that actually lots of people are just signing things a lot of the time just by not reading that very small thing. I've ticked it so many times. I'm getting hundreds of spam from different kind of companies because I didn't read that. So I think they treat it kind of the same. I don't know what's the solution with that. How can actually we make people more aware of the importance of these kind of documents? Is there any kind of, because there isn't any kind of legal consequence for them, but they should be aware, but I don't know how to make that the society at large, to make them a little bit more aware about the importance of this kind of becoming part of a research. What does it mean for them? So I think that's a much larger issue. I do remember from my own research when I gave to somebody this absolutely horrible participant information sheet that I've been asked to give to people in care homes. And he said, this is worse than I get from the bank. So it was really very bad. And I had to stay and explain what it means. So another thing that can be done is actually just put it in much more lay language, really translated. But, and again, what I was mentioning earlier, some people, some universities have really extremely good templates for that, very adapted. Others have this kind of bureaucratic documents that people just read and they just sign it. So I think another solution could be, instead of just trying to educate people about the importance of these kind of documents, is just how can we translate them? So I know there are still other kind of things about data management and all that kind of thing that sounds, I still don't understand it. At times I'm struggling to understand what I put myself in my own research there. I just don't, nobody came and explained it to me. So how can I explain it to those participants? Do I actually have to become an expert in all those kind of things? How can my participants become an expert in that? So I think that's one of the solutions. Just make it lay language, no matter how complicated it is, people have the right to understand it. And the level of understanding could be very different depending on extremely many different things. But we have that as part of integrity as researchers, we have that duty to our participants, because at the end of the day, they make us a huge service. We have research because they participated in our research. So at least that's the least we can do.
Thank you very much. So I think that was the last question. I want to thank all of our 4 speakers for really excellent, very, very thought-provoking presentations. Give them a round of applause. And since Miles set us the challenge of finding 3 things that we would do, maybe those are things that we can start to discuss outside. But actually, I think that's a really good starting point for the discussion we'll have this afternoon with the University of Scotland Research Knowledge Exchange Committee. And I'm glad also that we've got colleagues here from Scottish Funding Council in the room who will no doubt be listening to these things as well. So collectively, it's a really good challenge. But anyway, many thanks for your presence here today. Many thanks once again to our 4 panels. Thank you.